Deep inside a crumbling manor at the capital's edge, a masked figure watched a single letter curl into ash, already certain how this story would end. Weeks earlier, Wren Calloway had married into House Thornwood, bracing for cruelty, a cold duke, 3 dangerous children, a marriage the whole kingdom whispered would destroy him. Instead, the ice around that family slowly began to melt, and somewhere in the shadows, someone wearing his exact face could not forgive it. A hidden letter, a stolen life, a duke ready to burn the kingdom down before he let him go. So who was really behind that mask, and why did they want Wren gone so badly? Stick around, because we're about to find out together. Get comfortable? Because this one starts with a wedding nobody wanted, and ends with a duke who'd burn the world down before he'd let his husband go. If you've ever had to fake being completely fine in a room full of people just waiting for you to fail, we want to hear that story below. The first thing I noticed was the ceiling. Gold vines had been painted across white plaster, curling toward a chandelier dripping with cut crystal. Silk curtains breathed in and out with a breeze that shouldn't have existed in my studio apartment, because I didn't own silk curtains. I didn't own a 4-poster bed. I definitely didn't own a ceiling that looked like it belonged in a palace. The last thing I remembered from my old life was closing my laptop at 2 in the morning, eyes burning, one hand still hovering over the final page of a novel I'd sworn I would only read one more chapter of 4 hours earlier. I remembered thinking, right before sleep pulled me under, that I was glad none of it was real. That thought had aged badly in the span of a single night. I sat up too fast and the room spun. Young Master Wren, a maid was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. My heart dropped straight through the floor because I knew that name. I knew it the way you know a song you've heard 1,000 times. Instantly, painfully, completely. Wren Calloway was the most despised character in the novel I had finished reading at 2 in the morning, the night before whatever this was. Not a villain exactly. Worse, a punching bag with a pulse. The story called him the poisonous stepmother, even though Wren was very much a man, because the moment he married into House Thornwood and became legal guardian to the Duke's 3 children, that was the role the narrative shoved him into. The readers hated him in the comments. The servants hated him on the page. The children hated him with the kind of coordinated cruelty only fictional siblings can manage. And by the final chapters, the family he'd married into had quietly, systematically destroyed him. I looked down at my own hands. They were shaking, and they weren't mine. "I'm Wren," I said out loud, mostly to see if it was true. The maid frowned harder. "Are you unwell, young master? Should I call for the physician?" I wanted to laugh or scream or possibly both at the same time, because I knew exactly how this ended. Wren Calloway died humiliated, friendless, abandoned by the very family that was supposed to have made him safe. And the people responsible for that ending, the terrifying, brilliant, ice-veined Thornwoods, were, as of this morning, my family. I threw the blankets off and stood so fast the maid flinched. "When is the wedding?" She blinked. "This afternoon, young master." I froze. Today. Of course it was today. Of course I'd landed in this body on the single worst possible morning to land in it, because in the book this was where everything started going wrong. Wren married Duke Cassian Thornwood for money, for a title, for a way out of debts his own family had drowned him in, and everyone in the ballroom knew it. Cassian knew it. His children knew it. And because the entire marriage had been built on a foundation of contempt, it cracked, then it collapsed. And 30 chapters later, Wren was dead, and nobody at the funeral cried. I grabbed my head like that would somehow keep the panic in. No, absolutely not. I am not doing this. Because the Thornwoods weren't just cold. They were a slow-motion catastrophe with excellent tailoring. The eldest boy, Rhett, was a manipulator so gifted the narrator openly admired him. The middle son, Julian, grew into a war criminal by book 3. The youngest, Noelle, could out-strategize grown diplomats before she'd finished growing, and Duke Cassian Thornwood was worse than all 3 of them stacked on top of each other, merciless, brilliant, and beloved by every reader who wasn't currently trapped inside his household. I had adored him from the safety of my phone screen. Now the thought of him made my stomach fold in on itself. The maid touched my shoulder gently. "Young master, please, sit down." I took a breath instead. Think. If I was going to survive this, I needed to understand exactly how the original Wren had failed, so I could do the opposite. And the answer was obvious the second I asked it. Wren had tried too hard. He'd begged for approval, forced affection nobody wanted, performed the role of loving parent for an audience that had already decided to hate him no matter what he did. He'd spent every page trying to win a game that was rigged against him from the first line, so I wouldn't play it. I smiled, and something about the way it felt on my face must have looked dangerous, because the maid took a full step back. "If this family wants a villain," I said, "I'll give them the scariest stepmother they've ever seen." 3 hours later, I walked into the cathedral in borrowed silk, and every eye in the building turned to watch me do it. Nobles whispered behind fans. A few didn't bother hiding their smirks. Others watched me with something closer to pity, which told me Ren's reputation had already been in the gutter before the ceremony even started. Fine. Lower expectations meant less to lose. At the altar stood Duke Cassian Thornwood, and I finally understood why half the internet had a crush on a fictional man. Black hair, sharp jaw, shoulders built like an argument you'd lose, and eyes the color of wet steel. He looked at me the way you'd look at a contract you hadn't finished reading. Not hatred, not warmth, just careful, total attention. Somehow that was worse than either. The priest spoke. The words blurred past. Then, "You may exchange your vows." Cassian's voice was calm and completely without music. "I will fulfill my responsibilities." Not exactly a sonnet. My turn. The original Ren had given a trembling, desperate little speech about love and devotion that the comments section had mocked for 3 chapters straight. I wasn't repeating that mistake. "I also intend to fulfill my responsibilities," I said, pleasant as tea. One of Cassian's eyebrows moved. Barely. A millimeter, maybe less. But I saw it. And something about being noticed by a man like that made the back of my neck go warm in a way I refused to examine. The ceremony ended. We were married. My countdown to disaster officially began. The Thornwood estate looked less like a mansion, and more like something a king would apologize for showing off. As our carriage rolled to a stop, servants lined both sides of the entrance in 2 silent, watching rows. I stepped out first and immediately found them. The 3 children standing together at the top of the stairs like a small, well-dressed firing squad. Rhett, Julian, and Noelle, all 3 staring at me with the exact same expression. "Are you going to be a problem?" Good, that made this simple. The original Ren would have swept toward them with open arms, desperate for a scrap of affection. I walked straight past all 3 without a word. The silence that followed had weight to it. I heard Noelle gasp softly. Rhett's eyes narrowed. Julian looked personally offended, as if I'd insulted his ancestors instead of just ignoring him for 4 seconds. A servant hurried up beside me, alarmed. "Young master, shouldn't you greet the children?" "No," I said. "I'm tired." I disappeared into my new room and didn't come out until dinner. The dining hall that evening felt exactly the way I remembered it from the page, tense enough to cut glass. Cassian sat at the head of the table, Rhett to his right, Julian and Noelle across from each other, watching me the way you'd watch a fuse. I took the seat at the far end, as far from all of them as the architecture would allow. In the book, this was where Ren had tried desperately to fill the silence. Nervous chatter, forced compliments, a performance nobody bought. I ate my soup instead and said nothing. Julian cracked first. "Aren't you going to say anything?" I looked up. "About what?" The whole table went still. "You usually try to talk to us," he said. Like I'd broken a rule he hadn't told me existed. I changed my mind. I went back to my food. I could feel every pair of eyes on me now, including Cassian's. The future villain looked baffled. The future mastermind looked suspicious. The future strategist looked, if anything, fascinated. Good. Confused enemies made fewer mistakes on purpose, but they also made far more mistakes by accident. Dinner ended without a single raised voice, which the servants' faces suggested had never happened before in the history of this house. Everyone left the table quietly, unsettled, including me, because as I walked back toward my room, I felt something shift in the air behind me, like gears turning somewhere out of sight, like the story itself had just noticed it was being rewritten. Somewhere in that enormous house, someone was already watching me. Carefully, curiously, a little too closely. The game had started, and I had no idea yet that every effort I made to disappear from the Thornwood family's notice was only going to drag their attention closer. By morning, the entire estate was waiting for me to fail. I could feel it the second I stepped into the hallway. Servants going quiet as I passed, guards watching a beat too long, even the maids moving carefully around me like I might go off. They were all braced for the same thing, a scene. In the novel, the original Ren had started making enemies within a day of the wedding, criticizing the staff, demanding authority he hadn't earned, trying to bulldoze his way into being the children's parent by force of will alone. I had no intention of repeating a single one of those mistakes. Unfortunately, the house seemed determined to drag me into a confrontation anyway. I was eating breakfast alone, in blessed silence, when the butler approached with the particular stiffness of a man delivering bad news politely. "Young Master Wren, the young masters and the young lady are waiting for you in the training hall." I nearly choked on my tea. In the book, this meeting happened weeks after the wedding, not the morning after. The story was already adjusting itself around me, which meant I couldn't trust the timeline I'd memorized anymore. "Wonderful. Why?" I asked. "They requested a family meeting, a family meeting." Translated honestly, that meant an interrogation with better lighting. The training hall took up an entire wing, all polished wood and cold morning sun. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me the second I walked in. Rhett sat on a bench with a book he clearly wasn't reading. Julian leaned against the wall, arms crossed, doing his best impression of intimidating. Noelle stood between them with her chin lifted, radiating the specific confidence of a 12-year-old who has already decided she's the smartest person in the room. I sat down across from all 3 of them and waited. Nobody spoke first. Eventually, I raised an eyebrow. "Well?" Noelle blinked, caught off guard. "Well, you called the meeting. You requested it," I said. "I'm just here." Julian pushed off the wall. "What are you planning?" There it was, the real question, finally out in the open. "Planning?" I said. "Don't flatter yourselves. You ignored us yesterday." "Correct. You didn't try to impress our father." "Also correct. You didn't try to act like our parent." "Correct again." His expression darkened. "So what do you want?" I actually thought about it before I answered, because it deserved a real answer. "Peace and quiet." The room went silent. Rhett spoke for the first time, his voice low and unhurried. The calm of someone who'd already run this conversation 5 different ways in his head before it happened. "You expect us to believe that?" I looked straight at him. The future mastermind, the smartest of the 3, the character who in the original story eventually brought half the kingdom's nobility to its knees out of sheer boredom. "No," I said. "I don't." That threw him. A small crack showed in his composure before he smoothed it back over. "Interesting." "I don't particularly care whether you believe me," I added, and let the silence sit there until it got uncomfortable for everyone but me. The meeting ended without either side getting what they came for them at least. For me, it was useful. I'd learned something valuable. These 3 were obsessed with figuring me out, and people who are obsessed with a puzzle become predictable in exactly the ways that matter. 3 days passed, then 5, then a full week. The household grew steadily more confused because I wasn't doing anything. No scheming, no manipulation, no attempts to seize control of a household that clearly wasn't mine to run. I spent my days reading, walking the gardens, drinking too much tea, which created an entirely new problem, because they started following me. At first it was subtle. A flash of pale hair behind a bookshelf, a too familiar shadow crossing the garden path, footsteps that always seemed to correct themselves whenever I changed direction. Then it stopped being subtle at all. I was sitting under an old oak tree one afternoon when I closed my book without looking up. "You can come out now." Silence. I sighed. "Noelle." A small figure stepped out from behind a hedge, cheeks pink with the particular embarrassment of someone who thought they were being clever. "How did you know?" "You've been following me for 20 minutes. 20. She looked genuinely startled by her own commitment to the bit. "That long, apparently." I set the book down. "Did you need something?" She studied me with real suspicion. "Why are you being nice to me?" I almost laughed because in this house, it seemed, not actively tormenting a child counted as an act of generosity. The original Wren had set an unbelievably low bar. "I'm not being nice," I said. "I'm being normal." "Then why aren't you mean?" "Everyone said you would be." That landed harder than I expected. For a second, I wasn't looking at a future strategist or a plot device. I was looking at a lonely kid who'd been braced for cruelty her entire life because cruelty was the only thing that had ever been reliable. Something in my chest pulled tight, uncomfortably, dangerously. I wasn't supposed to get attached. I answered her honestly anyway, because you haven't done anything to deserve it. Noelle went completely still. Then she turned and bolted without another word, calling back over her shoulder. "I don't understand you." I let her go, but I noticed movement in a second-floor window as she ran, Rhett, watching from behind the glass, and from the look on his face, he'd heard every word. That evening, small things started changing around the estate. My tea started arriving exactly the way I liked it, though I'd never told anyone how I liked it. The library staff began leaving books on my desk that I hadn't asked for, but ended up wanting anyway. A maid smiled at me in the hallway and didn't look terrified doing it. Eventually, the head maid, a stern older woman named Petra, cornered by me near the stairs, and to my genuine shock, bowed. "Thank you, young master." "For what?" Her eyes went a little glassy. "The kitchen girl." It came back to me slowly. 2 days earlier, I'd watched a supervisor unfairly blame a junior kitchen assistant for a mistake that wasn't hers, and I'd simply said so out loud in front of witnesses. It hadn't felt like anything. No one else in this house, it seemed, had ever bothered. "The staff expected you to use your new position against people who couldn't fight back," Petra said quietly. "You protected one of us instead." That sentence sat in my stomach like a stone the rest of the day. How bad had the original Ren been, exactly? That basic decency read as a miracle? I was still turning that over when I ran into Cassian in the hallway that night. Literally ran into the sound of his voice, since I hadn't seen him standing there in the dark. "Ren." I froze. "Your Grace." He was studying me the way you study something you haven't decided is dangerous yet. Not with hunger. With curiosity, which was somehow worse, because curiosity from a man like that had a way of turning into a decision. "The children talk about you constantly," he said. "Should I apologize?" "No." His eyes sharpened. "I find it interesting. Extreme danger." In the version of this story I'd read, Cassian only found people interesting for one of two reasons. Because they were useful to him, or because they were a threat. Neither option ended well for me. "What exactly is interesting?" I asked. He took a slow step closer, then another, until barely a breath separated us. "You married into this family," he said. "You gained a title, wealth, influence." Another step. Now he was close enough that I had to tilt my head back to hold his gaze. "So why do you behave as though you want none of it?" I had no prepared answer, because the honest one sounded absurd out loud. I didn't want power. I didn't want status. I wanted to survive a story that had already killed the person whose life I'd somehow inherited. "I just want to be left alone," I said instead, which was close enough to true. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite disbelief, not quite understanding. Just attention, focused entirely on me, the exact kind of attention I'd spent my whole plan trying to avoid. And the harder I tried to disappear from this family's notice, the more it seemed to be working against me. I had made a catastrophic error, and I didn't fully understand how catastrophic until Duke Cassian Thornwood decided I was interesting. Because in the source material, Cassian only paid close attention to two categories of people, the ones he needed and the ones he wanted eliminated. I didn't want to belong to either list, and yet he seemed determined to sort me into one of them regardless of what I wanted. The next morning made that painfully clear. I walked into the dining room expecting my usual solo breakfast, and instead found the entire family already seated, waiting. That had never once happened before. Cassian at the head of the table with his coffee, Rhett with a book he wasn't reading again. Julian looking deliberately bored. Noelle staring at the door the second I walked through it. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto me at once. I briefly considered leaving. That would only make it worse, so I sat. Silence. A very loud silence. I picked up a piece of toast. "What?" Julian nearly choked on his juice. "What do you mean, what? You're all staring." "We are not. You are. We're not. You are," I said again, and Noelle buried her face in her hands while Rhett looked entirely too entertained for someone who claimed not to care. Then Cassian spoke, and the room's attention snapped to him instantly. "You'll be attending tonight's banquet." I froze. Absolutely not. In the original story, that exact banquet had been the disaster that started Ren's downfall. Public humiliation, a political scandal, enemies made in one evening that took years to unmake. I had zero interest in reliving it. "No," I said. The whole table stopped moving. Even the servants along the wall went rigid. No one, it seemed, ever said no to Duke Cassian Thornwood, which was exactly why I'd said it. Cassian lowered his coffee cup with deliberate care. "No? Correct." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain," I pointed at myself. "I don't like people." Silence again, and then Noelle laughed. Actually laughed. A real startled bark of a sound that surprised her as much as it surprised everyone else. She clapped a hand over her mouth immediately, mortified, and looked away. Cassian watched the whole exchange very carefully, which felt once again more dangerous than reassuring. Everything about this man felt dangerous. Unfortunately, refusing the banquet turned out not to be an option regardless of what I wanted, and 3 hours later I was standing on a fitting stool while a tailor pinned fabric around me with the grim focus of a man defusing a bomb. The original Ren had loved events like this, the attention, the gossip, the spotlight. I preferred books and, ideally, not dying, which by this point felt like the more ambitious goal. The banquet hall that evening looked like something out of a fever dream, gold everywhere, 100 conversations happening at once, and every single person in the room finding a reason to glance my way. I lasted almost 40 minutes before a smooth, well-dressed noble named Lord Desmond cornered me near the refreshment table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lord Wren," he said, "I've heard so much about you. None of it good, I assume." He laughed, a touch too loud. "You're quicker than they said." He leaned in slightly. "A word of advice, if you'll take it. The Duke's family is not what it appears. Be careful who you trust in that house." That sounded genuine, which unsettled me more than an obvious threat would have. In the book, Desmond had spent years manipulating the original Wren for his own gain. So why warn me now? Before I could ask, a voice cut through the noise behind me, cold enough to lower the room's temperature by 10 degrees. "Step away from him." Desmond's face went pale instantly. I turned to find Cassian standing there, silver eyes fixed on the other man, with an intensity that made the surrounding conversations quietly die. And in that moment, I understood something important. Cassian wasn't protecting me because he cared. Not yet. He was protecting me because, as far as this house was concerned, I now belonged to it. That realization felt even more dangerous than the alternative. Desmond retreated fast. When we were finally alone, Cassian looked down at me. "You attract trouble." I was standing still, I said. "You still managed to find trouble standing next to you." "Fair," he admitted, which was the closest thing to a joke I'd heard from him yet. The rest of the evening passed almost peacefully, until the dancing started, because of course it did. This was, after all, a romance novel with a body count. I was actively trying to escape toward the terrace when a hand appeared in front of me. Large, steady, unmistakable. I looked up slowly. Absolutely not. Cassian's expression didn't change. "Dance with me." Not a request. A handful of nearby nobles audibly gasped, which told me this wasn't normal behavior for him, which meant every eye in the building was about to be on us. "Wonderful. I don't dance," I said. "You do now. I don't want to." One eyebrow lifted, the smallest possible challenge. Then, to my horror, I caught sight of all 3 Thornwood children watching from across the room with the exact expressions of people settling in for a show. Traitors, every one of them. Cassian extended his hand again, and somehow refusing a second time felt impossible in a way I couldn't fully explain. I placed my hand in his, and the entire ballroom went silent, as if everyone present had just watched something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Judging by the look on Cassian's face as he led me onto the floor, he might have been thinking the exact same thing. The moment my hand touched Cassian's, I understood that whatever piece I'd been hoping for was officially finished. The ballroom watched us in total silence. Nobles stared, servants stared. Even the musicians seemed to lose the thread of the song for half a beat. To be fair, I understood why. In the original novel, Cassian never once initiated a dance with Wren. Their entire marriage had been cold from the first vow, a transaction dressed up in silk, and yet here he was, waiting for me at the center of the floor like it was the most natural thing in the world. I briefly considered faking a fainting spell. Too late. The music started, and Cassian pulled me into the first step before I could think of an exit. He was, infuriatingly, an excellent dancer. Of course he was. A man that perfect should have been allowed one visible flaw, and apparently dancing wasn't going to be it. I concentrated on not stepping on his feet, not staring at him too obviously, and not thinking too hard about how close we were standing. I was failing at all 3 simultaneously. "You look nervous," he said, low enough that only I could hear it. "I'm surrounded by people who want gossip. That's fairly normal for you." A faint smile crossed his face, barely there, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but real. And judging by the ripple of whispers around the edge of the dance floor, I wasn't the only one who noticed it. Extreme danger. If this room decided Cassian actually liked me, my life was about to get significantly more complicated. "What are you thinking about right now?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Survival," I said honestly. That earned another almost smile. Great. Now I was entertaining him without even meaning to. When the song ended, the room erupted into hushed conversation exactly as I'd expected. I escaped to a balcony overlooking the palace gardens the second I could, grateful for the cold night air and the 5 minutes of quiet it bought me. It lasted about that long. "You really are strange," said a voice behind me. I didn't bother turning around. Rhett, the future mastermind, stepped onto the balcony, looking irritatingly composed for someone who'd clearly followed me on purpose. The Thornwood family had, collectively, won some kind of genetic lottery. "What do you want?" I asked. "Answers." He leaned against the railing beside me. "You keep creating more questions instead of giving them." I couldn't even argue with that. He studied me for a long moment. "You're not interested in my father's title." "No." "His money." "No." "His influence." "No." I finally looked over at him. His eyes had narrowed slightly, calculating. "Then what does interest you?" I looked up at the stars instead of answering right away, and the truth slipped out before I could stop it. "People." Silence. He frowned. "People." I immediately regretted saying it out loud. "Forget it. No." His voice softened, just slightly. "Explain." I hesitated, then decided honesty was less exhausting than pretending. Everyone in this world sees the title first. Nobles, servants. Even the people who hate someone or love someone usually only see the position they hold. Duke, villain, hero. I glanced toward the ballroom lights. Almost nobody bothers looking at the actual person underneath it. Something shifted in Rhett's expression, a small crack in the mask he wore even at 17. For just a second, he didn't look like a future mastermind who'd eventually outmaneuver half the kingdom's court. He looked like a tired boy carrying expectations nobody had ever asked whether he wanted. Then the moment closed back up and his usual composure returned. But I'd seen it, and from the look on his face, he knew I had too. The following week brought a new complication. The children had gotten attached. Not emotionally, not yet, but intellectually, in the way you get attached to solving a puzzle. They started appearing wherever I went, the library, the gardens, the music room, sometimes, impressively, all 3 locations within the same hour. I tested it once, deliberately changing direction 6 separate times while walking the grounds. 10 minutes later, all 3 were still behind me. I stopped, turned around, and stared them down. They froze mid-step, caught completely. "Why are you following me?" I asked. Julian looked offended on principle. "We aren't. You absolutely are. We're not. You've been behind me for 20 minutes. Noelle looked away immediately, guilty as anything. Rhett sighed, resigned. Caught, all 3 of them, until Julian recovered enough to cross his arms defensively. "Then why do you keep going to interesting places?" he demanded. I blinked. Interesting places? The library. Yes. The greenhouse. Yes. The lake. Yes. Understanding hit me a beat too late. Oh no. The original Wren had never once visited any of those places, which meant everything I considered a perfectly ordinary way to spend an afternoon looked, to them, like fascinating new behavior from a man they'd already decided was unpredictable. I had accidentally become a source of entertainment. A few days later, the entertainment nearly cost someone their life. I was reading in the greenhouse when a servant burst in, panic all over his face. "Young Master Wren," the young lady. My stomach dropped. "Noelle." I didn't wait for the photosynthesis. We reached the estate's training paddock a few minutes later to find a crowd already gathered. Servants, guards, stable hands, all of them frozen with fear. Noelle stood beside an agitated horse that was one wrong movement away from serious injury, trying very hard to look brave and failing at it completely. The original Wren, according to the book, would have screamed for someone to fix it and made the whole scene worse. Instead, I walked forward slowly. Noelle. She looked at me, trying not to look terrified. It wasn't working. "Stay still," I said. The horse snorted and stamped, and several guards moved to intervene. I held up a hand. "No, everyone stay back." I stepped forward instead, one slow movement at a time. I remembered something from a riding lesson in my old life, that frightened animals mirror frightened people, so the only useful thing you can do is refuse to be frightened, even if you have to fake it. I forced my breathing even, step by step, until I finally reached the horse and laid a hand flat against its neck. The paddock went completely silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the horse's ears flicked, and it relaxed under my palm. The crowd exhaled as one. Noelle looked stunned. The guards looked stunned. Honestly, I was a little stunned myself. I hadn't actually expected that to work. The situation resolved without injury, and I thought that was the end of it, until I turned around and found Cassian watching from the edge of the field. He hadn't said a word, hadn't moved to help. He'd simply been standing there, silver eyes fixed entirely on me, with an expression that went past curiosity into something warmer, something I didn't have a name for and didn't want one for either, because it terrified me more than the horse ever had. That evening I tried to hide in the library. Reasonable plan. It lasted until sundown, when the door opened and it wasn't Rhett, or Julian, or Noel. Cassian shut the door behind him, and the library suddenly felt much smaller. "What happened this time?" I asked. He crossed the room slowly and stopped beside my chair, studying me the way you'd study something you couldn't quite solve. "You saved Noel. It wasn't a big deal. It was to her." His voice dropped quieter, and to me, my heart skipped once, and that one skip was more than enough. Every survival instinct I had screamed the same warning, because this wasn't supposed to be how the story went. Cassian wasn't supposed to look at me like that. His children weren't supposed to trust me. This family wasn't supposed to care, and yet, somehow, the story was rewriting itself in real time. For the first time since I'd woken up in this world, I found myself wondering whether the real threat here wasn't the Thornwood family at all. Maybe the real danger was letting myself get attached to them, especially to one particular Duke, whose silver eyes seemed increasingly unable to leave me alone. The trouble with changing a story is that eventually the story tries to change back, and when it doesn't do it gently. 3 days after the incident with Noel and the horse, the atmosphere inside the estate felt different. Warmer, softer, more comfortable than it had any right to be. And comfort, I knew from painful experience, was just attachment wearing a nicer coat. Attachment led to loss. I understood that better than anyone in this house, because every time I looked at this family, I remembered exactly how their story ended in the version I'd read. The betrayals, the bloodshed, the funeral nobody cried at. No amount of warm dinners changed. What I knew was still sitting somewhere down the road, which meant I needed to be careful. The Thornwoods, unfortunately, had other plans. I walked into the dining room one morning and stopped dead. Something was wrong. Rhett was sitting in my usual seat, Julian directly across from it, Noel beside Julian. They'd boxed the empty chair in like hunters setting a trap. "What are you doing?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Julian looked far too innocent. "Eating breakfast. You're plotting." His grin confirmed it instantly. Noel rolled her eyes. "You make us sound like criminals." "You're future criminals," I said, before my brain caught up with my mouth. Silence. Total silence. Even the servants froze mid-step. I looked away immediately, hoping that if I ignored the last 5 seconds hard enough, reality might follow my lead. It did not. Julian leaned forward. "What did you just say?" "Nothing." "You definitely said something." "I didn't." "You did." I sighed. This family was exhausting in ways the book had never fully captured. That afternoon I retreated to the greenhouse, hoping for 5 minutes of peace. I got about 5 minutes before the door opened again. I didn't look up. "Rhett." A pause. "How did you know? You're becoming predictable." He actually looked offended by that, which I genuinely hadn't expected him to be capable of. He sat across from me anyway, and for a while neither of us said anything. "Tell me something," he finally said. "No, you haven't heard the question yet." Still no. He sighed, more dramatically than I expected from someone who prided himself on control. "I want to know about your childhood." My heart skipped, and not in the good way this time. That was dangerous ground. Because I technically wasn't Ren. I belonged to a completely different world, one with electricity and glass screens, and none of the things that made sense here. Those memories still felt half real, like something I'd dreamed rather than lived. It was a normal childhood, I said. Not exactly a lie, just incomplete in a way he could never guess. Rhett studied me for a long moment, then let it go, which surprised me more than if he'd pushed. He looked up at the greenhouse glass instead, sunlight scattering across his face. "You know," he said eventually, voice softer than I'd heard from him. "Things feel different lately." I didn't answer, so he kept going. "The house, my siblings." A pause. Me. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then I offered quietly, "Maybe that's a good thing." For some reason that made him smile, a small, genuine one. Nothing like the calculated expressions he usually wore. And somehow that smile scared me far more than an argument would have. Julian cornered me 2 days after that in the fencing yard of all places, holding 2 practice swords like he'd been waiting for an excuse. "You don't know how to fight," he said. Not a question. An astute observation. "That's genuinely a problem." He tossed one of the swords at me. I caught it badly. If people keep trying to kill you, you should at least know which end is sharp. I assumed that part was obvious. He almost smiled, the first real one I'd seen from him, quick and a little embarrassed, like he hadn't meant to let it show. For the next half hour he corrected my stance, my grip, my footwork with the exact same blunt, impatient energy he used for everything else, and somewhere in the middle of it I realized he wasn't doing this because his father had asked him to. He was doing it because the idea of me getting hurt again clearly bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "You're still terrible," he announced afterward, breathing hard. "Thank you very much for the lesson, truly." I didn't say stop coming back. He said it fast, already walking away, refusing to look at me, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing anyone in this house had said to me yet. That evening, real trouble arrived, the political kind, which was worse than either of us had been braced for. A royal messenger rode in from the capital, and the second I saw the seal on the letter, my stomach dropped. Cassian opened it, and his expression turned to stone. "What happened?" Noel asked. He folded the letter slowly. "The Crown Prince is coming to visit. Chaos." Julian nearly dropped his glass. Rhett's brow furrowed. Even the servants exchanged nervous glances. I blinked, confused by the scale of the panic, and then it clicked. Crown Prince Callum Ashvale had been one of the most dangerous characters in the entire novel, brilliant, charming, and manipulative enough to run 3 conspiracies while smiling through dessert. Exactly the sort of person I most wanted to avoid, which of course meant he would find me within the hour of arriving. He arrived 2 days later, and the whole estate scrambled to prepare, extra guards, extra staff, extra everything. I attempted to disappear entirely. That plan lasted about 30 minutes. I was reading under a tree when a shadow fell across the page. I looked up and immediately regretted it. Prince Callum's smile was gorgeous and completely untrustworthy. The exact smile of a man who has never once told anyone the whole truth. "Lord Wren," he said, "you're a difficult man to find." "That was intentional, Your Highness." He laughed, delighted rather than offended. "You're exactly as interesting as they say. Danger, immediate danger." "I assure you I'm not interesting," I said, standing. "That's the most interesting thing you've said yet." For the next hour, he trailed me through the gardens, asking questions, making sharp little observations, smiling the entire time like this was the best afternoon he'd had in months. Eventually, I stopped walking. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Investigating me." His smile widened. "Caught," he admitted cheerfully, which was almost respectable. Before I could respond, another voice cut through the garden, cold, sharp, unmistakable. "What exactly are you doing?" Cassian stood a short distance away, silver eyes locked on the prince with an intensity that dropped the temperature of the entire garden by several degrees. Callum smiled wider, entirely unbothered, and stepped a fraction closer to me. A mistake, and clearly a deliberate one, because Cassian's expression went darker instantly. Then the prince turned to Cassian, gaze bright with mischief, and asked, perfectly casual, "Do you mind if I borrow your husband for the afternoon?" Total silence. Even the birds seemed to give up. I took a slow step backward because this felt like standing between 2 storm fronts. Cassian's answer came instantly. "No." One word. Calm, controlled, absolute. My heart did something complicated. The prince's smile turned knowing, as if he'd just confirmed a theory he'd been testing, and by the look on Cassian's face, he'd realized the same thing at the exact same moment. That night I lay awake, with one thought circling endlessly. This story was changing faster than I could track. The children trusted me, the servants respected me, the crown prince was fascinated by me. And Cassian was starting to look at me in a way the original Duke had never once looked at the original Wren. I couldn't decide whether that would save my life or end it, and somewhere in the depths of that enormous house, someone else had finally noticed that Wren Calloway wasn't behaving the way the story said he should, and they were already preparing to do something about it. For the first time since arriving in this world, I felt genuinely afraid. Not of Cassian, not of the prince, not even of the family's future. I was afraid because the story itself had started moving again, and stories in motion tend to leave bodies behind. The next morning, the estate felt tense in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Servants whispered in corners. Guards stood a little too alert at their posts. Even the children seemed distracted. I found out why at breakfast, when Cassian walked in, carrying a stack of documents and an expression cold enough to freeze the coffee. "Father?" Noel looked worried immediately. He set the papers down. There was an attack last night. The room went still. What kind of attack? Rhett asked. One of our merchant convoys was ambushed. Cassian's eyes darkened. My stomach twisted because I remembered this. Not this exact attack, but what it led to. In the original novel, a slow campaign of political sabotage had eventually destabilized House Thornwood from the inside, ending in a betrayal that cost multiple lives, Wren's included, and now it had started far earlier than the timeline I remembered. The story was accelerating, and that was never a good sign. I retreated to the library to think, and had barely opened a book when someone dropped into the chair across from me, uninvited. I didn't even have to look up. Your Highness, Prince Callum grinned. Good morning. How did you get into the library? I walked. Helpful. As always, you're overjoyed to see me. Overwhelmed with joy, I said flatly, and he laughed like I'd complimented him, entirely immune to sarcasm, or possibly just enjoying it too much to notice. Then his expression shifted, turning uncharacteristically serious. Tell me something, Danger. Serious questions from clever people were always dangerous. What? What do you think about loyalty? Not the question I expected. I considered it honestly before answering. I think loyalty has to be earned. It isn't owed just because someone has a title. He looked surprised for a moment, then thoughtful. Interesting. Most nobles believe loyalty should simply be demanded. That's usually why they lose it. He stared at me for a long beat, then burst out laughing, loud enough that a nearby servant nearly dropped a tray. Apparently, I'd become entertainment for royalty twice now, which felt like a dubious achievement at best. Later that afternoon, I made a mistake that would matter far more. I overheard something I was never meant to hear. It happened near sunset, in one of the older, quieter wings of the estate. Voices drifted from behind a half-open door, low, tense, careful. The original Wren, according to the book, would have walked right past without a second thought. I stopped instead, because apparently I was either smarter or considerably dumber than the character I'd inherited. There hasn't been an opportunity, said a nervous voice. Then create one, answered another, cold and unfamiliar. My pulse spiked. The Duke rarely leaves his family unguarded, then separate him from them. A pause. And Wren? Everything in me froze. My name. He's become a problem, the second voice said, low and amused in a way that made my skin crawl. He doesn't even act like himself anymore, the nervous voice muttered. A short, humorless laugh answered him. He looks exactly like himself. That's the entire problem. I didn't understand what that meant. Not yet. I filed it away anyway, the way you file away a splinter you can't dig out. Small, sharp, impossible to ignore. A problem. I'd spent the last month reading books and drinking tea. How exactly had I become a problem? The conversation continued, each sentence worse than the last, until one realization settled over me with the weight of a dropped stone. Someone wanted House Thornwood destroyed, and I had somehow become an obstacle in their way, which meant I was now a target too. While trying to slip away unnoticed, I stepped on a fallen branch. It snapped like a gunshot in the quiet. The voices stopped instantly. My heart nearly stopped with them. Someone's there, one of them said, and I didn't wait to find out what happened next. I ran, faster than I think I'd run in either of my two lives. Footsteps chased behind me, close, determined, definitely gaining. I turned one corner, then another, trying to lose whoever it was, and failed completely, until a hand suddenly closed around my wrist and yanked me sideways into a hidden side passage. I nearly screamed before I recognized him. Cassian. He pulled me deeper into the passage, pressed a hand lightly over my mouth, and went utterly still. His body was close, far too close, and my brain simply stopped functioning as a useful organ. Footsteps rushed past the opening a moment later without slowing. Whoever had been chasing me kept going, never noticing the two of us pressed into the dark. The silence afterward felt enormous. Cassian slowly lowered his hand. Neither of us moved. The passage was small enough that I could hear his breathing, close enough that I could count the shadows along his jaw, close enough that my heart began behaving like a traitor. Explain, he said quietly. Right, conspiracy, assassins, possible murder, focus. I told him everything, word for word, as much as I could remember. By the time I finished, his expression had gone terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that comes right before something very bad happens to whoever caused it. The realization hit me a beat later. He wasn't angry because someone had threatened him. He was angry because someone had threatened his family, which now, apparently, included me. That night, security around the estate doubled. Guards multiplied. Investigations began before dawn. Yet despite all of it, the thing that stuck with me most happened just before midnight, when a knock sounded on my door. I opened it to find Rhett standing there, unusually serious, almost worried. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "You were being chased." Not a question. I froze. How did he already know? My face must have answered for me, because he exhaled slowly and looked away, frustrated at the situation rather than at me. "You need to be more careful," he said quietly. For some reason, those 5 words hit harder than any grand declaration could have, because they were simple and because they were real. Before I could respond, he turned and left, and I stood alone in the hallway trying to process the fact that the Thornwood family, the family that was supposed to eventually destroy Ren Calloway, was, instead, worried about keeping him alive. Somewhere out in the dark, an enemy was still watching, still planning, preparing for a move that would force this entire family to choose a side, including, I suspected, a certain duke whose pale, watchful eyes had started following me everywhere I went. The attack came 3 nights later, and it very nearly worked. I woke to shouting. For one disoriented second, I thought I was dreaming. Then came the ring of steel, a distant scream, and every survival instinct I had snapped fully awake at once. Alarms echoed through the halls outside. My stomach dropped, because this wasn't supposed to happen yet. In the original novel, the first direct assault on the Thornwood estate happened months from now, not weeks. The timeline was collapsing in on itself again, and that meant one thing. Whoever was behind this had stopped watching and started acting. I bolted from my room into a hallway full of chaos. Servants ran in every direction. Guards sprinted past with weapons drawn. I caught the arm of the nearest servant. "What's happening?" "Intruders," he said, pale as paper. "Where?" "The East Wing." My stomach twisted violently. The East Wing, the children's rooms. I ran without thinking. The mansion had never felt this enormous. Every corridor stretched on forever, every staircase took a lifetime. As I rounded a corner, the sound of fighting grew louder, closer. Then a figure stepped into the hallway ahead of me, dressed in black, face covered, blade drawn. We both froze for exactly 1 second, then he charged. I realized, with painful clarity, that I was not a fighter, not even slightly. I barely managed to dodge the first strike. Steel whistled past my ear, far too close for comfort. Adrenaline flooded through me as he swung again and again, each attack faster than the last. I stumbled backward, scanning desperately for anywhere to run. Then someone else was there, blocking the strike meant for me. Steel met steel in a shower of sparks. Cassian? Of course it was. He stood between me and the assassin with fury burning in his eyes. Real fury, the kind I hadn't seen from him even once before. The attacker hesitated for half a second, and that hesitation cost him everything. Cassian moved in 3 precise strikes, and the man dropped to the floor, unconscious before he finished falling. The silence afterward felt enormous. Cassian turned toward me, and his expression hadn't softened at all. If anything, he looked angrier than before, which confused me, since I was the one who'd nearly been killed. "Are you hurt?" It sounded less like a question and more like a demand. "No," I managed. He stepped closer anyway, checking for injuries with careful, methodical attention, and only exhaled once he'd confirmed I was telling the truth. For the first time, I saw something underneath the anger. Fear, not for himself, for me. The rest of the night dissolved into chaos. Captured attackers, secured hallways, urgent investigations that stretched until dawn. By the time the guards finished sweeping the grounds, one detail kept surfacing in every report. The East Wing had never actually been the target. The children's rooms were untouched, the intrusion there loud and clumsy on purpose. It had been a diversion, staged to pull every guard in the house in one direction, so that a single man with a blade could walk straight toward mine. By breakfast, something in the house had shifted permanently. Nobody argued, nobody joked. The previous night hung over the table like a storm that hadn't quite finished passing. Then Noelle set down her fork, and the small sound echoed through the silent room. "You could have died," she said quietly. The words landed harder than anything shouted could have. Julian looked away, jaw tight with an anger clearly aimed at the situation, not at me. Rhett stared at his plate, thinking, calculating, probably already imagining several inventive ways to end whoever had ordered the attack. I found myself deeply relieved he wasn't my enemy. Then Noelle stood, walked around the table, and hugged me. My brain simply stopped working. The room froze along with me. Servants, guards, even Julian looked stunned. Noelle herself seemed a little surprised by her own actions, but she didn't let go. Don't scare us like that again, she whispered. Us! Not me. Us! Something in my chest pulled tight in a way that had nothing to do with danger, because for the first time, this family wasn't treating me like an outsider they'd been forced to accept. They were treating me like I belonged. Emotional moments, unfortunately, rarely lasted long in a house this politically important, because shortly after breakfast, Prince Callum arrived again, looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man with apparently no responsibilities of his own. He found me almost immediately. Ren, no, I haven't even asked anything yet. I know. You're wounding me already. Good, he said, and laughed. Then, unexpectedly, his expression sobered into something serious and rare. I heard about last night. So did most of the kingdom, I imagine. Probably. His gaze sharpened. Be careful. That wasn't what I expected from him. He sighed, and for the first time since we'd met, he looked genuinely concerned rather than amused. Whoever is behind this isn't an ordinary political rival. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He hesitated, which worried me more than anything he could have said outright. There's a group operating in the shadows. They've existed for years. A pause. They've infiltrated noble houses, manipulated wars behind the scenes. His voice dropped lower. And I believe they've recently set their sights on the Thornwoods. None of this had been in the novel I remembered. Either the story had changed that drastically, or the original Wren simply never lived long enough to find out. Neither possibility comforted me. That evening brought one more surprise I wasn't remotely prepared for. I was standing alone on a balcony, trying to process everything. The attack, the conspiracy, the secret organization, and the increasingly complicated feelings this family kept pulling out of me, when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. Cassian stopped beside me without a word. For a while neither of us spoke. The night air felt calm in a way the rest of the day hadn't allowed. You shouldn't have run toward danger, he finally said. You sound like Rhett. That earned the barest flicker of amusement. Then his expression softened, just slightly. Ren. The way he said my name made my heart skip, in a way I really should have stopped letting it do by now. I looked over at him. A mistake, because his silver eyes were already fixed on me with an intensity that made it hard to remember how breathing worked. You've become important to this family, he said quietly, honestly, without any of his usual careful distance. Rhett trusts you. Julian respects you. Whether he admits it or not, Noel adores you. His gaze didn't move from mine. And I. He stopped. For the first time since I'd met him, Duke Cassian Thornwood looked genuinely uncertain, and the sight of it nearly knocked the breath out of me completely. Then footsteps sounded nearby, and the moment shattered instantly. Cassian looked away, and whatever he'd been about to say stayed unfinished. A confession left hanging in the dark, and somehow that made it worse, because now I couldn't stop wondering how it was supposed to end. Meanwhile, deep within the capital, in a room I would never have found on my own, a masked figure received word that the assassination had failed. The messenger trembled as he delivered the report. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then the masked leader rose slowly from their seat. Interesting, they said, voice calm, too calm. Ren Calloway survived. Again, a pause stretched out. Then the figure smiled beneath the mask, cold and entirely certain. Prepare the next phase, they said, because this was never really about destroying House Thornwood. It's about Ren. And soon everyone is going to understand why. The next phase began exactly 1 week later, and it started with a kidnapping. I knew something was wrong the moment I woke up. The estate felt unnervingly quiet. No footsteps in the halls, no distant conversation drifting up from the kitchens, no birdsong from the gardens. The kind of silence that usually shows up right before disaster does. I left my room immediately and found out why. A letter waited outside my door, addressed to no one but me. My blood went cold as I opened it. If you want the truth about Ren Calloway, come alone, no signature, no further explanation. Just those 2 sentences, and somehow I already had a guess about who'd written them. An hour later, against every scrap of good judgment I still possessed, I was standing outside an abandoned manor at the edge of the capital, because apparently curiosity beat survival instinct every single time, and that was going to get me killed one of these days. The building looked ancient and forgotten, exactly the sort of place you read about people vanishing from. That should have been enough warning on its own. I went inside anyway, and regretted it almost instantly when the door slammed shut behind me on its own. A dozen masked figures stepped out of the shadows around the room. I was beginning to suspect this particular brand of villainy had a serious creativity problem. Then another figure stepped forward. The leader, unmistakably, the same voice from the reports, the same person who'd ordered every attack on this family so far. We stared at each other for several long seconds. "You actually came," they said, sounding almost amused. "You invited me," I said, folding my arms. A soft laugh. "You really are different." There it was again. Different. Everyone kept saying it. And I was starting to understand it had become a problem in its own right. The leader reached up and pulled off the mask. My heart stopped. I recognized the face immediately, and it made absolutely no sense at all, because standing in front of me was Ren Calloway, my exact face, my exact eyes. For several seconds I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then it hit me, not the original Ren, his twin brother, a character mentioned exactly once in the entire novel, in a single throwaway sentence about a sibling who'd supposedly died young. Apparently not. He smiled coldly. "You finally understand." My mind raced through everything at once. The attacks, the obsession, the investigations, the sheer amount of interest this house had suddenly attracted. None of it had ever really been about the Thornwoods, not entirely. It had been about the Calloway family, about secrets buried long before the wedding, before the novel, before any of this started. He stepped closer. "You stole everything that should have been mine." "What?" I frowned. "The life," he said, voice darkening with every step. "That family, that position, that Duke." The room went silent, and understanding arrived all at once. Jealousy, resentment, years of watching from the shadows, and believing every single thing his brother had should have belonged to him instead. He'd spent his whole life convinced of it, and now he wanted it back, whatever the cost. Unfortunately for him, I was simply too exhausted at this point to be afraid. "You're insane," I said flatly. The room froze. He blinked, genuinely startled. Apparently no one had ever said that to him quite so plainly. Good. Someone needed to. Everything happened at once after that. The doors exploded inward. Steel flashed through the room. Guards flooded in, and chaos erupted around us. And at the center of it stood Duke Cassian Thornwood, looking absolutely furious. He crossed the room without hesitation, without slowing down for a single one of the fighters in his path, heading straight for me. For one absurd second, the entire battle blurred into background noise, because all I could see was him, his silver eyes, his expression, the relief he clearly wasn't managing to hide at all. Then he reached me and pulled me straight into his arms. The whole room seemed to freeze, myself included. Neither of us moved for a long moment. Then I heard it, his heartbeat, fast and unsteady against my ear. Cassian had been afraid, not of losing the fight, not of losing power or status or any of the things that mattered to him on paper. He'd been afraid of losing me. The fighting ended quickly after that. The conspiracy collapsed within hours. The twin was captured, and with him, an entire secret organization that had spent years operating in the dark finally came apart at the seams. One by one, the threats disappeared. The danger, finally, genuinely was over. Buried in the interrogation reports was one name I recognized, Lord Desmond. Not a conspirator, as it turned out, just a man who'd heard rumors of what was coming and hadn't known how to say so without sounding insane. His warning at the banquet, the one I'd spent weeks assuming was manipulation, had been the closest thing to the truth anyone outside the organization had managed to offer me. I made a mental note to thank him properly, once my hands stopped shaking. Or at least, that should have been the end of the story. Several days later, the whole family gathered in the garden, and for the first time in months, everything felt peaceful. No conspiracies, no assassins, no political disasters waiting around the corner. Just family. A strange thought, one that still didn't quite feel like it belonged to me, but felt right regardless. Noelle sat beside me reading. Julian complained loudly about something that didn't matter. One of the practice swords propped against his chair, like he still hadn't given up on turning me into someone who could hold his own in a fight. Rhett pretended, unconvincingly, not to enjoy any of it, the usual, and for once I felt genuinely, completely happy. Not the fragile, temporary happiness of someone waiting for the next disaster, but something steadier, something that had quietly become the ordinary shape of my days, without my noticing exactly when it happened. Then footsteps approached, and I didn't need to look up to know who they belonged to. Cassian stopped beside me. The children immediately went quiet with suspicion. Noelle most of all, which was concerning in its own right. "Walk with me," Cassian said. All three children perked up with far too much interest. Traitors, every single one. The garden was quiet and beautiful in the fading light. Eventually, we reached the lakeside, the same spot I'd taken to visiting alone whenever the house got too loud. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Cassian stopped walking and turned to face me, and his gaze had gone soft in a way I'd only ever seen once before, a softness reserved, it seemed, only for me. "That night," he said. I frowned. "What night?" "The balcony." Realization hit instantly, the unfinished sentence, the confession that had never gotten a chance to land. My heart betrayed me immediately, all over again. Cassian stepped closer, not intimidating this time, just honest, completely honest. For the first time since I'd met him, I never finished what I meant to say. The world went very quiet around us. Then he smiled, small and real and genuinely beautiful, and said the words that changed everything. "You became important to this family." A pause, "and you became important to me." My heart stopped, then restarted at roughly twice its usual speed. "So," he said, taking another step, "I have a question." I couldn't speak, couldn't think, could barely manage to breathe. His gaze never left mine. "Will you stay?" A simple question, and somehow the easiest one anyone had ever asked me. Because despite everything, despite the danger and the chaos and the sheer absurdity of having fallen into this life by accident, House Thornwood had become my home. And Cassian had become something far larger than that. I smiled. "Only if you stop staring at me like that." He actually laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind most of the kingdom would never believe he was capable of. Then he took my hand gently, and for the first time since arriving in this world, I stopped worrying about how the story was supposed to end. Somewhere behind us, I could hear Julian loudly informing Noelle that he'd absolutely been the one to teach me how to hold a sword properly, and Rhett's dry, immediate correction, and Noelle's delighted laugh cutting through both of them. It was such an ordinary sound, siblings bickering in a garden at sunset, that for a moment I forgot to be afraid of how much I loved hearing it. Because maybe this wasn't the story I remembered anymore. It was ours, and for once, it had a happy ending. We poured everything into every twist of Ren and Cassian's story, and now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest, or which Thornwood you'd trust with your own heart. If this story kept you watching until the very end, a like and a subscribe means the world to us, and helps us keep telling stories just like this one. Thank you truly for being here.